to know about equations of sine and cosine. Y equals A sine bx plus c. The important things I'm looking at here are A, which is my amplitude, B, which is the frequency, and C, which is the midline. Now remember, to get the period, that would be 2 pi over your B value. So let's look at a couple of these. So on this one, I want the amplitude and I want the period. Remember that there is an unwritten 1 out here, so the amplitude of this curve would be 1. Now the frequency here is 4, which means from 0 to 2 pi we would fit 4 curves. So the period is going to be 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. And hopefully that makes sense. If what I'm saying is from 0 to 2 pi, I'm fitting 4 full curves, right? So 1 full curve, 2 full curve, 3 full curves, 4 full curves. Then if that is 2 pi, I'm breaking it up into 4 parts. Each one would have to be half a pi. So this is my amplitude, and that is the period. All right, let's do one more of these. Let's do number 6. So y equals 3 sine 2/3 x. So amplitude here is 3. So I know that from the midline to the top would be 3. The frequency is 2/3. So from 0 to 2 pi, I can fit 2/3 of a curve. And so the period would be 2 pi over 2/3. And what you need to be able to do there is say, okay, that's 2 pi times 3 over 2, which is, remember that's just over 1, 6 pi over 2, which is 3 pi. Now if you wanted to do that on your calculator, what you would do is 2 over 2/3, and then just multiply that answer by pi. Okay, let's do this from some graphs. So I want to find amplitude and period, and then try to write an equation. So on number 7, let's look at this. Your midline's at 0. So the amplitude here is the distance from the center to the top, and that is 3. So A equals 3. Now the period, which is the length of one curve, this is a sine curve. It starts at its midline. It goes up, comes down, and goes back, and it would start repeating right there, right? If I drew another one, that would be an exact repeat. So the length of one of those curves is pi. Okay, the length of one of those curves is pi. So the period here, sorry for that noise, is pi. But what is the B value? So remember that frequency is 2 pi, or over the period, which is 2. Now the other way you could figure that out is by looking from 0 to 2 pi and seeing that there are 2 full curves. So this would be y equals 3 sine, because it starts at its midline, 2x. All right, let's try another one of these. So let's look at this one. So first of all, I see this is a cosine curve. So y equals blank cos blank x, and then plus blank, right? We've talked about doing that. On this case, the midline is 0, so you don't need the plus at the end. Now, your amplitude from the center to the top, middle to the top, is 4. So amplitude is 4. And let's look at the period. So cosine curve starts at its max. It's going to go down and come back up in 2 pi. So the period here for one full curve is 2 pi. Now remember that your frequency, and there's 2 ways you can figure it out. The first way is to say, oh, from 0 to 2 pi, there is one full curve. Now the other way you could figure that out, remember, is that frequency is 2 pi over the period. So you could do 2 pi over 2 pi, which tells you that your frequency is just 1. All right, let's do another one of those. Let's go down here. Actually, let's just do some graphing. Let's graph some. Let's jump into this. So we're going to graph these on the interval from -2 pi to +2 pi. And so let's check out this one. So on this, I look at this. Okay, my amplitude is 4. My frequency is 1, because that's 1 sine, or 1x, right? And so the period is 2 pi over 1 or 2 pi. Now the midline is going to be at y equals 0. So graphing this, I'm going to start with my midline, which is at 0, so that's just your x-axis. And I know that a full curve should go from 0 to 2 pi. So that is my full length there. And notice this one's already 8 boxes for you, but if you had to label this yourself, you could just go out 8 spaces. Now, what do I want to graph? Well, I know it's a sine curve, and sine starts at its midline. And then what's my amplitude? Well, this is going to go up to 4 and down to -4, right? And you could label each one of those if you wanted, but make sure I can at least tell what your scale is. And now let's graph. So sine starts at its midline, it goes up to its maximum, comes back down to its midline, goes back to its minimum, and then comes back to there. So that right there is one full curve. Now, that is graphed from 0 to 2 pi. So we need to go backwards also. So I'm just going to repeat these points back here. And notice I don't have arrows on the end because I have a closed interval. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do 13. So y equals 2 sine 2x. So amplitude here is your a value, which is 2. Frequency is your b value, which is 2. Period is 2 pi over your b value, 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. So what that tells me is one curve will go from 0 to pi. And the midline is still y equals 0. So let's start this again. Ready? So midline is still the x-axis. It's a sine curve, so it should start at its midline. It will end back at pi. And so we need to do all 5 of those important points, but shrunk down in a smaller scale, right? So instead of skipping 2 between each, like I did on that top one, I'm going to just skip 1 box. So my max should be at 2, my min should be at -2. And so this would go up to 2, down to 0, down to -2, back to there. So that would be one full curve. And now we just need to repeat it. So back up, back down, back down, back up. And remember, your frequency is 2, so it makes sense that there are 2 full curves there. Same thing here. So this would go down, up, down. And then repeat it one more time. And that would be your curve. So let's look at another one. Let's try this one. So y equals negative cos 2x. So the idea with this is that your amplitude here is still 1 because amplitude is a height, right? This just says it's reflected over the x-axis. Your frequency is 2, which means the period is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi, and the midline is still 0. So this is going to have a amplitude of 1 and a midline of 0. Its cosine, which normally starts at its maximum, but since it's flipped, it's going to start at its minimum. And a full curve should take pi radians. So I know it's going to start here. It's going to come back down to its minimum here. And it's going to go 0, maximum, 0, minimum. So it's going to look like that. That would be a flipped over cosine curve, right? And then just repeat that. So you're going to keep repeating that in the amount of space that you have. And you also need to graph on the other side. So that would be like this. It's a little bit easier to connect on paper than on my iPad. All right, let's look at a little bit more interesting one. Let's look at this one. So y equals 3 cos 1/2 x. So amplitude here is 3. Frequency here is 1/2, which is the number of curves, so there'll be half a curve from 0 to 2 pi. Your period is 2 pi over 1/2, which is 2 pi times the reciprocal of 1/2, so that's 4 pi, and midline is still 0. So again, it's going to start at 0. The amplitude will go up 3, down 3, right? So you've got those points to contend with. Now you know that it's only going to do 1/2 a curve from 0 to 2 pi. So this is cosine. Its y-intercept should be at its maximum. And when I get to 2 pi, that should be at its minimum. It should be 1/2 a curve. So here, I would make that hit halfway between. So this would be what that looks like. And again, if they didn't label it, you could just go out 4 boxes and label that 4 pi. Here, again, you want 1/2 a curve in that space, so you can complete your curve. So if this is something you feel like you still have questions about, come see me. This is something that definitely we can continue to work on, but let's do some where maybe there's some vertical translations too. So this one, y equals 2 sine theta plus 1. So amplitude equals 2, frequency equals 1, which means the period is 2 pi over 1, or 2 pi. And then the midline is at y equals 1, because this is shifted up 1, right? So I'm going to start by putting my midline on here. And I just kind of do a dotted line. And now let's see what we know. So this is sine, so it's going to start from its midline, so that will be here. And I know that the period's 2 pi, so I'm going to count out 8 boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That will be 2 pi. And I know that the amplitude is 2. So from 1, it will go up 2, and it will go down 2. So this is 3, and that's -1. And so those will be my max and my min. So let's graph what we know. It starts at 0. 2 spaces later, it will go to its max. 2 spaces later, it will go back to 0, or it's not 0, it's midline. It will go back to its min, and then back up to its midline. So this is going to look like that. It should look the same as a regular 2 sine x. It's just shifted up. Now, it doesn't tell me how much to graph, so you could repeat this pattern over on the left side, right? You could graph it at its minimum, at its midline, at its maximum, and then back at its midline, and just repeat that. But this one does not give you a limited domain, so you should have arrows on the end of this one. All right, let's look at this next one. So y equals cos 2 theta minus 1. So first thing I see, amplitude is 1, right? 1 cos. Frequency is 2. Period is 2 pi over 2, which would just be 1 pi. And the midline is y equals -1. Okay, so here's what I've got. I know that my midline will be at y equals -1. I know from there it should go up 1 and down 1. So 0 and -2 would be your max and your min. The period is 1 pi, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to label that point pi. That's 1 period. And then every sort of 2 spaces, I'm going to put a dash, and that'll be where my points are. Now, this is a cosine curve, so it should start from its maximum. It'll go to its midline, to its minimum, to its midline, and back to its maximum. So that is what your cosine curve looks like. And again, yours should go perfectly through. It's a little hard on my iPad to draw it. And arrows on the end. Again, you could repeat it on the other side, but that would be 1 full period. Okay, let's do one last one of these. And this is sort of, I would say, the toughest that they're going to get is if you see something like this one. So y equals 2 cos 2 theta minus 3. This has everything all together. So amplitude, 2, right? That A value. Frequency, 2. Period is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. And midline is y equals negative 3. So when I graph this, I'm going to start with my line at negative 3. My amplitude is 2, so the highest I will go is up 2, the lowest I will go is down 2, right? The period is pi, so when I count over 8 spaces, so 2, 4, 6, 8, that will be pi. And you could label these pi over 2, pi over 4, etc. if you wanted. And then what I know is that this is a cosine curve. So cosine should start from its max, go to its midline, go to its min, back to its midline, back to its max. And so that would look like that, right? You could repeat it on the other side. This should have arrows on the end because they don't give us a restricted domain, and that would be what that looks like. Okay, final thing we're going to talk about are some word problems. Okay, sorry for that. I had a little bit recorded and cut out, so I'm just going back. So San Francisco Bay is an inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the dock, the depth of the water is 3 feet at low tide, and high tide is 71 feet, and that occurs every 5 hours. So we want to draw a graph showing the depth and then write a function. So let's see what we know first. So I know that at midnight, so let's consider this time midnight, time equals 0, that this would be at low tide, right? So it says the water is at low tide at midnight, and that is at 3 feet. So that's going to be 3, okay? High tide is 71 feet, which occurs every 5 hours. So this is 71 feet, and that occurs every 5 hours. So here's what I know. A full cycle will take 5 hours. Now, in this case, it's not starting at high tide. It's starting at low tide. And so what I know is it will be back to low tide in 5 hours. So this is going to be halfway between at 2.5 hours. Okay, because one full cycle is 5. So let's see what we know. So we already know our min and our max. What is this? I'm going to say, is this a sine or a cosine function? So this starts at its minimum, so this is going to be a cos function. And I know that's x plus blank. So if I can just figure out A, B, and C, I'll be good here. So let's start with what we know. We know that that's our min and that's our max. If I want to find the midline, there are 2 ways you can do it. You can find the distance between those, divide it by 2, and then add or subtract from the bottom. Or you can average them, and that will also give you your midline. So 74 over 2 is 37. So your midline here would be at 37. So this is 37. Now, think about what that means for your amplitude from the center to the top there, right? So from 37 to 41, that is going to be 34 there. This is a cosine curve that starts at its minimum, so that will be negative out front. And then I know that my period is 5, so the frequency will be 2 pi over 5. And I can't reduce that, so that is your B value. So that's what I have there. There's my graph. And then I've got negative because it starts at its minimum, 34 because that's distance from the middle to the top, 37 because that's your midline, and 2 pi over 5 because that's 2 pi over the period of the whole thing. Okay, you go to the carnival and decide to ride the Ferris wheel. The wheel is 3 feet off the ground and the diameter is 38. So let's see what I've got there. This is 3 feet, and then the diameter of the wheel is 38. So let's think about where that leaves us, thinking about sketching this graph. So the minimum here would be at 3. The maximum, well, 38 plus 3 would be at 41, right? And it takes us 4 seconds to reach the top. This is the world's fastest Ferris wheel. So it takes us 4 seconds to go from there to there. So the period of this Ferris wheel is 8 seconds, right? To go all the way around would be 8 seconds. So that should not be 10. We're going to ignore that for now. So if it takes you 4 seconds to reach the top, and it's going to take us 8 seconds to get all the way around. So let's draw a graph and write a function. So we get on the bottom. We are going to go up in 4 seconds and then come back down, and that will take us 8, right? So that's my cycle there. So I know this is y equals blank. Now sine or cos, this starts at its minimum, so cos blank x plus blank. Let's see what we know. So first of all, I know that the period is 8 seconds. So the frequency is going to be 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4. So that's going to go in there. Now, the period, we have the period and the frequency. The midline is going to be halfway between those. So again, you can find the distance between, cut it in half and add it, or you can average these. So 41 plus 3 over 2, which would be 22. So that's your midline. And then what is your actual amplitude? So that's the distance from the center to the top. And actually, if you think about the wheel, the distance from the center to the top is 19. That's also the distance from the center to the top here. So that's 19. Because it starts at its minimum, it's going to be negative, and that is my curve. Okay, so that's really the key to what you guys will want to be able to do for this test. If you have more questions, if you want to see more of something, send me a message. But hopefully going through these examples, going through all of this stuff, and just you doing some practice will help. The reason why I didn't do every single problem is I want you to be able to try them on your own as well. So we have done the first 2. Try the last one. If you still have questions, send them to me. And good luck, guys. You're going to do great. I will see you later.